So continuing on here, what's happening is that these businesses are growing so much, and the government really is not doing much about it, about the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. And really, the philosophy that allows this to happen is something called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically means hands off. It doesn't translate like that, but that's the idea. And basically, it means that the government is not involved in the economy. The government lets the economy go. This philosophy comes from economic ideas which were purported by a gentleman named Adam Smith back in the late 1700s, who basically said that the best economy is the kind of economy where people, individuals, should compete freely in the marketplace. So the best economy is one where the government doesn't hinder the economy. If folks back then who were growing their businesses and politicians who were allowing those businesses to grow back then were living today, they'd be appalled by the amount of taxes that we place on businesses, by some of the things that our government does, because their philosophy back then was that government should just basically do as little as possible. Government's in the way, that's a bad thing. So it's a very different type of climate. It's kind of up to the individual to succeed and fail. There's no safety net either if you fail as a business. Like, let's say you lose your job or your business goes under, there's really no charity. Well, there might be charities, I guess, but there's no safety net. There's no welfare check waiting for you. There's no social security. So it's a very different type of culture, I should say. And let me explain this here. So laissez-faire allows businesses and individuals to fail. And, back in the day, Charles Darwin wrote a book about the evolution of species, where he talks about evolution and the strongest survive and all that kind of thing. Well, economically speaking, some thinkers took that to mean, okay, well, in the natural world we have the evolution of species, but in the economic world we also have the survival of the fittest. The strong survive. The individuals succeed or fail. And the strongest ones become wealthy and the weakest ones become poor. Both of these thinkers here, William Graham Sumner and Herbert Spencer, were two thinkers that subscribed to this idea and were popular ideas back at that time. This idea that the poor deserve to be poor and the rich deserve to be rich, because what they're doing is they're everybody is responsible for themselves. Oftentimes these days when someone loses their job or somebody becomes poor, oftentimes we blame somebody else. We blame the government or we blame something else, a big corporation. But back in those days, it's like everybody is on their own, and that's generally how wealth and poverty is viewed. And social Darwinism is very much a part of America's psychology at that point in time. Like, we have all this economic growth, and if you're not part of it, you must be failing, you know. And so if you fail, it's your own fault. Well, there's different ways of viewing that wealth. Andrew Carnegie, going back to him, of course, the steel monopoly guy. Andrew Carnegie had a view of wealth called the gospel of wealth. Okay, so if you're wealthy, I guess there's different ways to be about it. basically, Andrew Carnegie wrote in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, that inequality is inevitable and good. It's going to happen. After all, Jesus Christ himself said, the poor you will always have with you. So Andrew Carnegie wrote about that. And he not only said that, he said that the wealthy should act as trustees for their poorer brethren. Like if you're wealthy, you have a responsibility to donate money and to give money away. This is kind of different than Charles Dickens' Ebenezer Scrooge, who says, well, if the poor are poor, that's their own fault, right? Which is a kind of the social Darwinism idea. But this is kind of not necessarily a social Darwinism idea. This is a guy who says, okay, I'm rich. My my responsibility is to give away money and to give back to the community. And the Carnegie Corporation did give lots of money back. They started universities, public schools, all kinds of things. However, you had guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's another monopolizer, who just he also gave away a large number of much of his fortune, but many of the rich guys that were gaining all this money and power were viewed with disdain in the community in which they were, America. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was was a guy who was hated because he had all this money. And look at his quote. He says, "Can't I do what I want with my money?" You know, it's like it's my money. I made it. Social Darwinism idea here. I made the money. I'm rich. I deserve every single penny. If you want to be rich too, you can do, you know, what if this, he's saying, what if this was you? I worked hard to get here where I wanted to get. You can do it too. Don't hate me because I'm rich. Let me do what I want with my money. Well, all this money and power started to develop an animus, I guess you could say, some ill feelings from the poor who were sweating their guts out, working in this industrial time, trying to support the big businesses that they were a part of. And what you see here is an interesting cartoon of just workers supporting the wealthy fat cats who don't do anything, who just live off the fat and the sweat of the labor. And this is kind of a communist cartoon too, if you notice the hammer and the sickle, which is kind of an interesting picture. But are these gentlemen protecting our industry, or are they oppressing the poor? And so what you start to have in this time is economically a labor movement that starts to grow. Workers start to become very conscious of the fact that there are some very negative things about all of this industrialization. So let's look at some of the bad sides of this industrialization. First of all, there's really no regulations on work days or work hours or work times. And so in some cases, you're going to have as many as 12-hour work days. There's no overtime, 6 days a week. Sometimes you'll be working. There's machinery that's not very well, it's not safe. Um, Factories are poorly ventilated. The conditions are absolutely horrible to work in. The pay is bad. There's no breaks, really. There's no mandated breaks. Now, obviously, you got to go to the bathroom, you're going to take a break. If you have to eat, you're going to take a break. But there's no mandated breaks. Not like today. There's no restrictions on child labor, for example. Children are working in factories. They're working in coal mines. They're working anywhere, really. Some children under the age of 15, some as young as 8 or 7. There's no restrictions on that. Of course, with all these people coming into the cities to find work, there's just massive filth, sanitation issues, pollution, there's disease, um, tuberculosis is rampant. You know, there's just really just a lot of bad stuff part of this. And so just to give you an example, if you look at this picture, here's a typical New York City sweatshop where they're making clothing. 1910, and there's the windows aren't open. There's just dirt and filth all over the place, and this is exactly the kind of factory that we're talking about. Children are working, and if you look at these pictures, they're very striking, and you can see that children are working in clothing factories, not very safe. There's no safety regulations in the workplace, no workers' compensation, right? So if a kid falls off this machine trying to grab this thing right here, which is an empty spool of thread, and gets their hands stuck in the machine, or slips, or falls, breaks an arm, well, you can always hire another kid. You don't need to pay for a hospital bill for a child or a worker. I mean, there's just so much abuse going on, and so there's different labor groups that are starting to sprout up, emerging consciousness of the fact that we're being oppressed by these workers, and we have no justice and no fair treatment. And so one of the groups is called the Knights of Labor. It's one of the first labor unions here. They actually had a symbol and a trade card here, which is kind of cool. Some goals of the Knights of Labor were to have an 8-hour workday. Anything over 8 hours is paid for overtime. To have factories that are owned by workers instead of by owners. Kind of communism ideas almost. Getting rid of child labor. That's what abolition means, getting rid of. So abolition of child labor, and also prison labor. Prisoners were being forced to contribute in the industrial sector of the United States. It's revolutionary here, equal pay for men and women. There was no equal pay for men and women. And there's still not, by the way. So this is a goal that they had, and also safety codes. Clearly marked exit signs, clearly marked safety regulations. Something simple as fire extinguishers in a factory. Just things we take for granted today. The Knights of Labor were very much into to try to fix some of the problems here in the United States. We also had another union sprout up called the AFL, not to be confused with the American Football League. This is the American Federation of Labor in 1886, led by a guy named Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers started this union to cater to the skilled worker, people that knew trades that could work with a specific trade in mind. Also representing workers in matters of national legislation, like if there's a lawsuit, you might be at your job and you might have been discriminated against or not received a fair pay for your labor, and it ends up in court. The American Federation of Labor would help you. Also maintaining a national strike fund, so that if you wanted to go out on strike, make sure that the workers who are out on strike are going to get paid to feed their families. And of course, working together between management and labor to mediate disputes. And as a result of these unions, you started to have labor union membership increase all the way up until 1920, and it's going to go even more up. And so workers are going to start to band together to unionize. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how the government tries to deal with these issues. How is the government going to deal with the expansion of the economy, the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, as well as just the growing workers' unions and the inevitable strikes that will occur in order to receive fair pay and equal pay.